Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you to everyone who is joining us here tonight. I'm Abby Pedikowski, and I'm a 1L at Columbia Law School and a member of our Education, Law, and Policy Society. Before I introduce our moderator, I just wanted to cover a few logistical details for tonight's event. We have prepared questions for our panelists that explore the struggles and perhaps successes of serving students with disabilities during the pandemic. Please feel free to use the question and answer function on Zoom to ask questions, as we will take audience questions as time permits. Our moderator for tonight's discussion is Josh Malkin. Josh is a third-year law school student and a member of our Education, Law, and Policy Society. Prior to law school, Josh taught middle school and high school math in New Orleans for 5 years. Last summer, he worked with the Mississippi Center for Justice to advocate on behalf of students and families whose IDEA rights were being violated. So with that, I'm thrilled to pass it on to Josh.
Thank you, Abby. The COVID-19 pandemic has turned the education system upside down, leaving schools in an unprecedented situation of necessary responsiveness and leaving students and families to adjust to a radically different learning landscape. As in so many areas of life, the pandemic has created gross inequities in the world of education. Those students who encounter the most barriers to a meaningful education in the best of times have, throughout the pandemic, been completely shut off from a meaningful education. Tonight, our panelists will discuss how they have worked to shine a light on this inequity and advocate for and with the students most impacted. On behalf of Columbia Law School's Education, Law, and Policy Society and Columbia Law Students for Disability Rights, I thank you for joining us for this all too important conversation. Please join me in welcoming our panelist. Margarita Velasquez is a bilingual speech-language pathologist with over 30 years of experience providing evaluation as well as treatment of speech and language disorders in preschoolers aged 3 through 5. In the Association to Benefit Children's integrated programs at the Graham School and Cassidy's Place, she works closely with parents and staff to support communication skills at home and at school. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she has provided services both remotely and in person. She graduated from Kansas University with a master's degree in speech language pathology. Welcome, Margarita. Thank you for being here. Courtney Yadu is an Equal Justice Works Fellow, sponsored by Kramer, Levin, Naftalis, and Frankel in the Special Education Unit at New York Legal Assistance Group. Her project helps families navigate the transition from preschool to kindergarten, called the Turning 5 process. Courtney began her career in education as a teacher in New York City public charter schools. She taught first, second, and third grade in both general education and integrated co-teaching settings. She received a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, an MST from Fordham Graduate School of Education, and a BA from Harvard University. Thank you for being with us, Courtney. Rachel Villegas has worked within the special education sector for over a decade as an assistant, teacher, and now leader. She has served as the special education department chair at 2 New York City charter schools, and she currently works in West Harlem. Prior to that, she oversaw the special education programs at the Jefferson Parish Public Schools in Louisiana, the largest school district in the state. Rachel received a BA in English Literature from NYU, where she also minored in English education. She earned her master's degree in teaching English and special education from the University of New Orleans and is currently pursuing her doctorate in educational leadership, administration, and policy from Fordham University. Thank you for being with us, Rachel. Last but certainly not least, Paola Jordan is a program manager and advocate specialized in disabilities policy, successful at engaging families from diverse cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds in advocacy. She graduated from the Mark School of Public and International Affairs, Baruch College, where she received her Executive Master of Public Administration degree. She is currently the co-director of the Metropolitan Parent Center, as well as the coordinator of the Autism Initiative Program at Synergia, Inc. After her daughter received the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis at age 2, she decided to focus her attention on acquiring the necessary knowledge and skills to help her child and other kids and families who are experiencing similar barriers accessing services for their loved ones. In her role as an advocate, Paula is an active participant of various committees in New York City and New York State, such as the statewide Early Intervention Coordinating Council and the ARISE Coalition. Paula is also an active participant in various advisory committees and cultural organizations, such as the Create Ability Advisory Initiative at MoMA, that promote inclusion and access for youth with developmental disabilities, especially in their education programs. Paula, thank you for being with us this evening. All right, so we are just going to dive right into questions here. Question 1, how has the pandemic exacerbated the systemic challenges that students with exceptionalities face? And why don't we start with Rachel?
Certainly, thank you for that introduction, Josh. I would say the challenges that we have seen exacerbated are those that can be associated with particular student learning challenges, as well as just some general like technology gaps. I think our students who have difficulties with changes in routines or procedures definitely had a rough start. And that took a lot of pre-planning on our part, and we still, I would say, couldn't be prepared in the way necessary to support those students. I would say now that we've been doing this for almost exactly a year, those students are in a better place, but it definitely started out very challenging. I would say students that face challenges with focusing, or really any student, due to distractions ranging from things that families can control, like gaming, to things that really no one can control, like how many people live in one unit or need to work in one room. That's creating a lot of challenges with our students, whether they have challenges with focusing or not. I think the larger just technology gap for both students and teachers actually, as well, you know, that can be the ability to type on a keyboard, or access to the technology in the first place. You know, the DOE promised a lot of things that didn't really happen, or access to internet in the household. We definitely were not prepared for that, and that is definitely a challenge that still persists. I think that the larger kind of concern is that during all these times of adjustment, as we've kind of located a problem and figured out how to address it, are all times when learning would otherwise be taking place if we were in the building. So if it takes us, you know, a week to figure out how a student can get internet in their apartment, that's a week that if we were in the building, that wouldn't be taking place. I would say, with the exception of some of the students' individual learning needs, a lot of the challenges we're facing are gaps associated in our city, or, you know, our larger country, with socioeconomic status and race, otherwise systemic racism. So therefore, in whole, a lot of these challenges have the potential, if I could say it in like one sentence, for just widening the achievement gap. That's all.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll pass the baton over to Margarita.
I think we had very similar challenges as the one Rachel mentioned. I think for us, we had young children between the ages of 3 and 5. And many of these children need a system, need a routine during the day to be able to learn. And I think one of the big challenges that we had was that they were now adjusting to learning from the routine of being at home. So their schedule during the day changed. So for example, they were not up at 11 o'clock in the morning. So it was very challenging for us to find times to be able to schedule sessions. So sometimes we would work with children even later on at night, working with the parents. The parents also had challenges with the technology. So at the same time, initially, we had a lot of difficulties trying to connect with the parents. So until they received their iPad. So technology was a big issue. The noise levels at home, that was a big problem. Working with the parents to helping them find space, an adequate space that was quiet so that we could work with the children. So it was a big adjustment in general, a big change for the parents. Plus the parents had their own issues with other children, dealing with their social emotional needs. Did they have food? That was very important. We always had to communicate that to our organization. So there were a lot of challenges that we really had to deal with in order to, as Rachel said, initially it was difficult, but as we became more familiarized with the whole system, it became easier. But it was more challenging for some children more than others.
Thank you. Over to you, Paula.
So the job that we do at the Parent Center is focused to families more than the child or the individual. And when you look at the job that we've been doing, we look at the whole coverage of the IDEA law from ages 0 to 21. So when you think about what issues we've been observing, let's gonna start with early intervention when families decide not to pursue services because it was hard for them to do telehealth via small smartphone, or because many families, especially those that are underserved families who do not speak English, they couldn't have access to an iPad with internet connection. So it's not that the child does not need the services, it's that there is another barrier because early interventions is a home-centered service. People come to your home. And for many, many months, that couldn't be possible. So that's one issue that we look in that area. When you look at the school-age children, let's gonna look for across the continuum of education. The issues that my colleagues here already raised and elevate are constant, especially in underserved communities, when many families are being essential workers, are families who have families in their own countries and they're going through processes of grieving, not being able to have the mental health, the support, or to support their families, they lost their income. And also you have families who have students attending residential placements, right? Non-public funded programs. We need to talk about them as well. The impact that COVID had on those families is another different level because you couldn't really be in contact with your loved one. You couldn't visit them in the school. Routines has been affected. I mean, it is something that right now we don't have the tools to measure the impact, but this is the perfect case study that I hope that someone, a higher education institution is taking note of that, because we are going to see the consequences in 1, 3, and 5 years from now.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Paula. Over to you, Courtney.
I will just echo much of what the other three panelists have already said. From the perspective of a legal services organization like NILAG, we really see that families have needs in so many different areas right now, whether that's housing insecurity, food insecurity, loss of employment, loss of loved ones. So there's so many systems that families need to navigate in order to have their needs met. And, the education system is just another one that can be really complex and confusing for families to get what their children need. And like so many others have said, with remote learning, one of the big challenges is that I think a lot of families are experiencing isolation right now. So whereas they might be able to walk into a school and speak with a social worker or speak with a teacher or meet with another family going through the same thing, there are many families who feel very alone right now, and that makes it even harder for them to find those resources that their children need.
Yeah, certainly. All right, Courtney, I'm going to give you the first attempt at question number 2. Have you observed any unexpected benefits of the remote learning environment?
So I think one big benefit for those families who have been able to, have the internet access and can reliably connect is that they now have this unique window into what happens during the school day. So they are seeing and hearing their children's therapists and teachers and school leaders more than they previously would have had access to. So I think for some families, it's strengthened the relationship between home and school. And related to that, I think that there are certain events that previously wouldn't have been accessible to parents, whether because the school building itself wasn't accessible or because the parent, due to their schedule, couldn't get to the school. And so now they're able to participate in things like parent workshops or other events at school. Or I guess a concrete example of one client that I have is that she's looking for a new school for her child that's very far from her home. It wouldn't have been possible for her to visit even in the best of times. And now it's just become normalized to go on a virtual school tour so she could actually go and see the classroom and the school building that her child will be in. So those are some positives that I've seen with the shift to more remote learning.
Gotcha. That's interesting for sure. We're just going to reverse engineer this. So back to you, Paula.
So I'm pretty sure that everybody in the audience have experience when you ask for accommodation and the answer is no, right? Remember that in your workplace or in school? So right now, barriers are being, removed for many, where now with the access to technology, we are able to see that different change and that it was a matter of attitude and intentionality from the Department of Educational Systems to provide those services and accommodations. So when you think about what's happening right now, when the conditions are the right ones, that means that you have an internet connection, that you have a device, you know how to use the device. We're seeing students that are doing really well, especially the older students, where let's say if you have an anxiety disorder, or if you're very child or mental health issues, you're doing the assignments at your own pace. You're doing your accommodations. You are doing it in the comfort of your home. And in that case, we're seeing that it's working for some. However, it's not working for everybody. So it's just important to keep that always in mind, because I'm a little bit concerned when we start thinking about the good things and everybody, okay, so let's apply for everybody, right? Let's gonna normalize something. So I just wanna make sure that it's clear that it's for some, and there's some evidence of that.
For sure. Margarita. You're muted, Margarita.
So I think for us, the benefits have been that continuation of services, that if children are sick or if their parents cannot send them to school, there's always the option of being able to provide services remotely. And I think that that's a big success for us in a way, because I think many of our children need continuation of services. And then I do see the benefits in the sense that we can work more closely with the parents. Many times parents work during the day and we cannot communicate with them. And I think that now with technology, it's more open so that everybody has more access, and we have more access in working with the parents.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Rachel.
Very similar to what Paula said, like there are a lot of students who, not a lot, there are a select few of students who did maybe not so well in person in the classroom that are doing remarkably well in this online platform. Students who already had accommodations for technology, students who have difficulties with fine motor skills. I would say they were even more prepared than some of my other students who are having difficulty with like typing right now. We had to sign up all of our students for typing.com memberships. But some of those students who had occupational therapy or had difficulties with fine motor skills were already using the computer or some sort of tablet, and were far ahead of some of my other students in terms of like typing and being able to utilize this technology. Students, like Paula said, who have social anxiety, I cannot tell you how incredible the chat function of Zoom is, and like how much those students have really like blossomed, being able to participate in class without, you know, some of our students are, we say that you don't have to have your camera on, you know, for various reasons. And some of those students that don't like to have that direct eye contact, who don't like to feel all eyes on them, can turn their camera off and participate just as well as any other students in the chat. So that's been really amazing. A lot of students have challenges with organization. It's just kind of more inherent that the organization is there on the computer. So, you know, they have calendar invites for each of their classes. They don't have to carry on these big binders with like papers all over the place. That's been a real benefit. Students who are visual learners, I found that teachers are using more visuals, probably because it's like really boring just to stare at your teacher's face for 90 minutes and they realize that. I think teachers also, especially in their first couple of years, shy away from group work or group learning due to, you know, management concerns. But remotely, there are really very few of those to take into consideration. So there is so much more like group learning happening in, you know, the Zoom breakout rooms. You know, if you could tell, we do use Zoom. I'm sure there's other things that people are using. And then just as Margarita said, really scheduling. Scheduling has been like, I mean, that's a huge headache as like the main aspect of my job that I dread every year. But, you know, at charter schools and some public schools, we don't have in-house service providers for a lot of the related services. So speech and occupational therapy, physical therapy, those types of related services. So whereas I would usually have an occupational therapist that would only be available to me like one school day, that would result in some students needing to miss ELA, science, social studies, math, those core contents. Now, the occupational therapist can be working with multiple schools in one day. And I only have one student literally right now who receives a related service during one of those core contents. And that's like virtually impossible when I'm in the building. So, you know, like Margarita said, the ability for students to receive services has greatly increased on this platform.
Thank you, Rachel. So I think a lot of the answers to the next question were included in your answers to question 2 with potential benefits to the remote learning environment. So I'm going to ask question 3, and if there are any additional thoughts, please feel free. But I do feel like a lot of you kind of incorporated these answers into your previous answers. So how has the pandemic changed the partnership and communication between schools and families? And how has this impacted students? So again, only if you feel like, if there's something additional you'd like to say, please feel free. If not, we can certainly move on to the next question.
I would like to say, Josh, that because the job that we do is connected directly with families, right? At the beginning, it was very, very hard. It really forced the school and or the program, in this case, early intervention or the public school or the non-public school, to be more intentional with those communications. We also had situations where the school, when that communication did not happen, contact ACS. And that I have not seen going to the mainstream, where parents are being still, looking through the lens of the punity approach, right? Instead of trying to understand what's going on with the family. We have some cases in our agency where that was precisely the case. And it was a big misunderstanding, right? But still the damage is done, right? So when you think about communication with the school, there's always this power relationship, right? And parents need, especially parents who are overwhelmed or raising their kids on their own or don't have the computer skills that maybe we have here in this audience, they need that additional support. And it took a very long learning curve for families, parents, or legal guardians or foster parents to be on point and trying to understand this whole new dynamics, right? Like, I don't know, one school is using Google, the other one is using something different. And this is really overwhelming. And in early intervention, I mean, seriously, I strongly believe that services should be provided in person, especially for the little fellas. I don't know if embedded coaching is going to be the next component, But it's very hard. It's very hard. Then the whole chaos with the iPad distribution, it really delayed. And there were gap in services, serious gap in services for thousands of students in New York City. And we still have situations, especially in pre-K, that parents are still waiting to hear about the iPad. So there are persistent issues that we have right now. And communication with families needs to be on their language. Interpretation services should be provided. Right now, right here, we have the closed captions. We can also have the interpretation channel. So it is a work in progress. Let's put it that way. It's not perfect. It's making some improvement, but it's not perfect.
Paula, if I may follow up there, obviously no amount of miscommunication with families is okay, but do you get the sense that things have improved over time since the start of the pandemic?
A little bit, and it depends. It depends also on the level of trust, the mutual trust that we have between the parents and the schools. I have heard from families that this is way too much, and they're literally at the end, at the bottom line, and they're kind of giving up on this. It's hard for families when we don't have the training. And remember, I'm speaking also as a parent of a disabled child. When we don't have that training, when you talking about behavior interventions, when you don't have that support, when you're 24/7 in this room, you cannot ask for more for families. It's just, there is not that much that you can ask from us. And that's something that I think has not been elevated enough to understand where we are in this point in time as parents of kids with disabilities with our own challenges at home. So that communication, it comes from that level of understanding, right? Of grace that sometimes is not happening. You need to be on time. Your child needs to be connected. What happens if the student has a meltdown? Who's going to support the child, right? And in between, they're going to lose access to ELA, math, you name it, everything. So it's chaos. It's absolutely chaos.
Can I say something?
Please.
I think that also when before the pandemic, we were just the therapists that would pull out the child, we would work with them. And I think this confinement and pandemic switched the way we work with the families. We had to think out of the box, dealing with the parents. I was not very knowledgeable with technology, and I had to work with the parents in teaching them how to set up their iPad so that they could work with me. So it was, that was interesting, and also dealing with the families and working closely and being understanding of their specific needs at that time so that they could really be available to work with us. So it was a mutual relationship and a mutual trust that we all had to develop with the parents so that we could all work together, because this became a team approach where I think the parents had to be more involved in our work with their child, more than before. And it was challenging. It was challenging with some parents, but then with other parents, it really worked very well, and it was very effective.
I can add, oh, go ahead, Courtney. I saw you open your mouth.
You can go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, I can add, you know, there have definitely been positive and negative aspects of communication with families. I think that this situation really forced students to have self-discipline. And I, you know, I don't know that many students working with largely K through 8 that, you know, have mastered those skills, no matter how much we like to think that we've instilled those in them. And so therefore there was a far greater weight put on parents and families in the pandemic than would regularly be put on them. Where I would usually walk by and tell a student to like put their phone away or teach next to them if you know, they were feeling very distracted, or tap on their desk, or otherwise we focus them in person. This is all now necessary for the parent to do. And there are only so many times I can call a student's name, but if that student has muted me to like play their video game, then you know, that is something the parent or guardian has to monitor and address now. And that definitely caused some contention between like the school and the families at the beginning. I would say, however, that this pandemic has also forced us to be better at our jobs in a lot of ways. So whereas I won't speak for every teacher, but whereas, there was a lot of gaps in communication that I witnessed prior to the pandemic, now it's forced us to have that communication, because like Paula said, like there's so many aspects of this that are unfamiliar to families, that really need to be addressed in order for the student to learn. And unless you're okay with students not learning, it really was necessary for us to step up our game. And I think that some of my teachers have much stronger relationships with families than they did otherwise when they were in person. Like Paula said, that's just not the case for everyone. I really wish that it was.
I was just going to add, for those who are new to the New York City school system, that when we think about communication, I think it's just such a big system. So, it's an enormous public school system, double the size of the next biggest one. So there are so many different schools that are all handling communication a little bit differently, or a lot differently. And so even one family who has multiple children, they might be on, different platforms, different communication for every school. And then even within a school, they're communicating with the physical therapist, the occupational therapist, speech therapist, different teachers. So it's just a lot of communication for families to handle. And so much has happened this year that this feels like a long time ago, but I think with communication, the start of the year was also very tough for many families, just with the different delayed starts to the school years and the different changes with how remote learning and in-person learning were going to be implemented. So I think that after what was a long spring and a long summer, a lot of parents had hope at the beginning of the year, and that was just a tough way to start the year with all the changes.
Great, thank you everyone for your insights. To pivot just a little bit to the bureaucracies of NYC DOE, how has the pandemic affected the district's ability to provide special education evaluations? And why don't we start with Rachel?
Certainly. I would say this is where it gets a little tricky. So first, to note, I'm not a psychologist, so I never would conduct an evaluation. But I would say, since I do work for charter schools right now, the evaluations are always referred to the Committee on Special Education. So in terms of referral, I'd say I've referred a small handful of students to the CSE, the Committee on Special Education, for reevaluations or related service evaluations this year. They were all conducted and produced the results that correlated with what we were seeing as a school, or what we thought was in the best interest of the student. That being said, in terms of referral for initial evaluations or change in classifications, keep in mind that I do work largely at the middle school, so initial evaluations are somewhat rare. But I have been very wary of referral, because there are so many factors right now that we have to consider that might be affecting a student outside of a potential disability. So I think that's where we could see a lot of gaps next year, is hopefully we're in person next year, let me say that. But where students might have needed to go through the evaluation process this year, or maybe did go through the evaluation process this year and that wasn't what they needed. I think that a lot of teachers have come to me with concerns about students focusing, but I'm very hesitant to relay that information to the CSE or propose an evaluation for that student, because when I was in middle school, if this were to be going on, I would also be on MySpace, and they're not on MySpace, but I would also be, uploading songs to my iPod Shuffle. And I really, valued education just like the next student, and I had a lot of respect for my teachers. But this is an environment in which distractibility is running rampant and is, easily, everything is easily accessible. So I I think that's definitely a place that we could be seeing gaps next year is students maybe being over classified or students being underclassified, depending on who is running special education in that particular student's building.
So just to follow up on that quickly, Rachel, you think that the trauma that comes along with living through COVID-19 as a child may result in a push for overclassification next year? Like, sorry, does the question make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that definitely could be a possibility. I would, I think, like I said before, a lot of the challenges we're seeing are really just challenges that are associated with systemic racism. I mean, that lack of technology, the lack of internet, the multiple people being forced to live in one unit, and therefore students can't hear me when I'm talking to them. And we already see a huge overclassification of students with emotional disturbance, particularly Black and Brown students, particularly male Black and Brown students. So, I think that if you're a Black student growing up in this country and you don't have emotional disturbance, it's kind of a shocker. So I do see that there could be ramifications of just this trauma that everyone is experiencing being kind of pushed onto Black and Brown students, Black and Brown male students, and the overclassification of those disabilities being common. But also, I take full responsibility in not pushing some students through the evaluation process that may be needed to, just because I wanted to be able to account for everything that's going on outside of our control that may be contributing to some challenges in learning.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it to Paula. And Paula, just to remind you, the original question was, how has the pandemic affected the district's ability to provide special education evaluations? So feel free to either answer that, or if you prefer to respond to Rachel.
So before I respond to Rachel, let's going to remember that nothing has changed in IDEA law in terms of parents' rights and responsibilities. If the parent feels the need for their child to be evaluated, they can request evaluation at any given point in time. There's a huge misconception because we're in remote learning, something has changed in the law. No, nothing has changed in the law. And the part that calls my attention about this question is that if we're seeing situations in schools, I am not hearing from school to talk about response to intervention before even proceed with the special education referral. So right there, that is missing. I don't know if we're being distracted about the new methodology that is remote learning, or what's the issue here, right? In addition to that, conversations with parents needs to happen. This is exactly my point. We know our kids best. We know them. And if there is a concern, parents needs to be part of that conversation. In terms of the evaluations, last year, our Parent Center has been actively participating in weekly phone calls with the Department of Education, where we have learned directly from them what's happening in general speaking in terms of delivery of services during the pandemic. And one big issue was about evaluations. At a certain point in time, they were trying to find how to do this, right? Because when you have an evaluation, it's a standardized tool that you need to follow by the dot, right? In order to have the desired outcome, the reliability of the evaluation. So for example, right now, when you think about evaluations that are given to students who are suspected to have an autism spectrum disorder, we know that if you say, we're gonna do an ADOS, I will say, really, how is that looks like right now? Because face masks, that's not reliable. We cannot use an ADOS. And if someone is saying that right now, I will ask, are you using the face mask? Because that's going to make a big difference. Then right now, I know that evaluators, neuropsychologists, school psychologists, the people who have this training, they're looking at different assessment tools. At a certain point, they're saying, all right, how are we going to be able to do this evaluation? It's going to be via telehealth or it's going to be in person? and which exactly battery of evaluations we're going to be using. In addition to that, I'm hearing also that parents are being invited to record videos, so that can be part of the evidence at the moment to produce those reports. I just want to make sure that it's important to highlight, once a diagnosis is made, how it can impact the life of this person for the rest of their life, their education, the trajectory for the future is going to impact. So we need to be very careful how we are approaching this situation, especially now that we don't know how social isolation is going to affect, especially infants and toddlers and younger kids. We don't know if the behavior is a consequence of a disability or the environment. And if that's something that we can provide intervention and later on they can catch up. So when you think about evaluations, I will be very cautious in a way that who is giving me this information? Are you up to date to what's going on out there in terms of how we're providing those evaluations, right? And I'm going to so many IEP meetings where I'm hearing people repeating something that I heard someone saying that your child has some symptoms of ADHD, therefore it's ADHD, and that is going to be quoted in reports without any specific evidence. I just really want to make the point that we need to be very careful when we're describing students' abilities.
Thank you. Over to you, Margarita.
I totally agree with Paula. I think that unfortunately decisions are made based on evaluations that are done remotely. And unfortunately, children get an IEP, which is an individualized educational plan that is set for a whole year. And so sometimes what I've seen since I've started in September, some children have been evaluated in person and some children have been seen remotely. So we do get the results of the evaluation, we get the IEP. And unfortunately, I find that some of the evaluations are accurate, but I also find that there are evaluations that are not. And unfortunately, children are misplaced and are not necessarily receiving the services that they need. Now, on top of that, we have the bilingual, bicultural populations. And what happens with those children is that we cannot use any type of formalized testing. And so we have to evaluate in a different way. And we used to do that even before the pandemic, because by law, I'm not required to provide any standardized scores on bilingual children. And so that makes it even more challenging, I find, in really detecting those specific needs of the children. I find in my experience right now, 2 specific children who should have been in a more structured, more structured program. So they were unfortunately, now what we have to do is try to work with the families and eventually finding a program that is more appropriate. And also working with the specific IEP goals. And so what do we need to do to modify so that the children can get specifically their needs met in therapy. So I do feel it's very hard to make decisions, and it's a very big responsibility for a clinician to make their own impressions and recommendations on children that are so young and that you are not really seeing in person.
Gotcha. Thank you, Margarita.
Mm-hmm.
Courtney, I want to come to you, but I also want to potentially mesh this question with the next question that was designed specifically for you. So that question being, how has the nexus of the pandemic and education perhaps sparked unique litigation? So whether that's around, faulty evaluation procedures or not, where have you seen unique litigation around COVID-19 in education?
Okay, I can start with evaluations. So like Paula said, special education laws still apply right now. So in March 2020, when the pandemic first started, the US Department of Education issued guidance saying that districts still have that obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education or FAPE to all students. So I guess starting with the evaluation point, parents have a right to request evaluations, and after they make that request, they need to happen within a mandated timeline. In New York City before the pandemic, this was a problem. Evaluations often weren't happening within that mandated timeline. And I would say that at NILAG, we've seen that happen, post-pandemic, that after a parent makes a request, unfortunately, in many cases, in some cases, the request has been outright rejected, or other times the evaluation has happened, but it's taken way more time than the mandated timeline. Some other issues that we've seen during the pandemic, many students, did not receive devices. Some still don't have devices, or even if they do have them, they lack either a reliable internet connection or the cellular service where they live is spotty. So that makes remote learning inaccessible for them. Another really common issue that we've seen is that all of the services on the IEP are not being implemented. So a really straightforward case is that their IEP says that they should get 3 sessions of speech each week, and they're either getting no speech or less than the 3 sessions. A student's IEP might say that they should have a paraprofessional. They're learning remotely, so they're not receiving that service. What does that service look like in this type of environment? And then another common issue we've seen is that a student's IEP might mandate that they're in a smaller class, like a 12-student class or an 8-student class, but their parent or family members see that they're actually in a remote classroom that's much bigger than that, with more students than that student really can have for them to be getting the individual attention that they need. So a lot of those are big systemic issues. So I'll really briefly mention two of our peer organizations who have filed class actions to try to address some of those problems. So one of them is the Legal Aid Society. They sued the city for its failure to provide reliable internet access to students who live in the city shelters. So that lawsuit is seeking to force the city to install Wi-Fi in the shelters across the city. Another class action was filed by Advocates for Children, and that one is related to compensatory services. So for children who missed many of these mandated services, the parents, they can, through an administrative process, try to get makeup services. So Advocates for Children filed a lawsuit to try to create a more efficient way for all of these students to try to get the makeup or compensatory services that they might be entitled to. And if either of those lawsuits sound interesting, I encourage you to go to the websites for those organizations, and you can read the complaints and learn more.
Great, thank you. Okay. I want to take us to our final question, and then if we have time to go back, that's great, but I think it's really important and interesting for us to tackle this final question. Given the difficulties and potential benefits we've seen to kind of exploring and getting a feel for the remote learning environment, how, if at all, do you think the pandemic will change the way we educate and advocate on behalf of students with exceptionalities in a post-COVID world? And why don't we start with Margarita here whenever you're ready?
Well, I think as clinicians, we have learned other modes of therapy. I think that like I said before, I could not even share a screen before with a child, that now I've become much more knowledgeable in working remotely. So that has been, I think, a learning curve for us in general as clinicians. I think we have learned to work more closely with parents and integrate them more into our work. And I think that now with the open access of remote services and remote work, I think the parents could be more part of our work so that we can help more with generalization. I think we've learned, learning to just thinking out of the box in general in the way we do our work, and that learning to be flexible, that things do not always happen in a certain way. But I think in general, I think we all know we all need to know that children, regardless, have certain needs, and that those needs will always need to be implemented regardless of what is happening in general, either going back to confinement or going back to school. But I think learning to be more flexible and adjusting to the different changes so that we can still continue to provide these children with the services that they need. And I think empowering the parents from learning, what they can advocate for, so that their children can get the services that they need and have and succeed. That's what I think would be what I would add.
So hopefully our increased capability to be flexible, learn throughout the pandemic can be carried forward into
Definitely.
post-pandemic.
Definitely, knowing that also we have technology and remote services, so it makes us see things in a more global approach, that there's not just one way of providing services, that now we have other alternatives that are also effective, and that we do know remote does work and is beneficial for some of our children, and it may not necessarily work for others, but at least we know that we have other modes, other tools that we can also use to better help our children in need.
Thank you. And I also appreciate you expressing that you learned how to share screen. My mother
Yes.
is listening to the call, so now she knows that it is possible to learn that skill. I will pass it over to Courtney.
I will just echo what Margarita said. I think more flexibility to meet families where they are, and think creatively about how we can deliver services and reach families.
Thank you, Courtney. Over to you, Paula.
So as an advocate and as a parent of 2 disabled students receiving special education services in New York City, and an aunt of 2 other disabled niece and nephew, I will focus on equity and equality, right? Right now, we're looking to things through the lens of equity. That's going to provide internet for everybody. But equality is like, let's going to think about the individualized needs of my daughter on her IEP, the individualized needs of this particular student that is clear, is outlined on the IEP. And just to be mindful that we need to be absolutely sure that we're meeting those needs, right? Right now, hearing people talking about learning loss in this year. I was one of those. And a great advocate told me, Paula, we're putting the loss on the student with a disability, because that's the framework where I come from, right? And no, it's not really. It should not be like that. It should be instructional deficit, because remote learning was new for everybody. Absolutely everybody across the board, providers, policymakers, advocates, parents, students, everybody. And we really need to analyze what's the outcome, what are the best practices. There is no clear best practices. Everybody's talking about best practices, right? I would say recommend the practices before even jumping to normalize something, right? And my concern is that we are going to jump into this remote approach when it's clear that there is no equality among New Yorkers, especially those that are in urban and suburban areas, or low-income families, or those living in shelters. And that's, as an advocate, rest assured that we're going to be there pushing back on that great idea that we're going to move everything this way. The other part is that not every single student with a disability benefit from remote learning. It's crucial to continue protecting in-person services, especially therapeutic services. Is that right? 45 years ago, families before me had been advocating and fighting for this, for the protection under the law, for those rights. And now that we have all this novelty of remote learning, we cannot go backwards. We need to find a way that we're going to be able to provide what every student needs based on their needs, right? So that's my take for you guys, in a way that let's think about equality and equity before we're trying to normalize this, that we still don't see how's the outcome for everybody.
Thank you, Paula. Ms. Villegas, to you.
Yeah, very similar to what others said. I really hope that it will push people to be more inventive in their everyday practices. I think that we've built up so many skills, and our teachers have so many different things in their tool belt than they had at the start of all of this. And I hope that they continue to use those skills and build those skills. I think, as far as my school and my teachers are concerned, I would love to carry with us that improved family communication. I definitely understand that's not the case for all schools and all teachers and all relationships, but I even for myself, I would like that to continue. Um, I think overall, Paolo spoke about equity, and I think that this is a really unique time for us to push equity in a way that we have been preaching but not practicing prior to this. I think, I highly doubt that my school, for example, will be back fully in person in September or August or whenever we start. And I think there will be some sort of hybrid learning going on. My push for next year is to really look at every single student's individual needs and say, like, okay, yes, parents can opt in or opt out of in-person learning, but which of our students really learns best in person, and which of our students actually was flourishing in this remote environment? And maybe being able to cater to their individual needs that way. So similar to what I said at the beginning about, being more inventive, can we have students that, maybe are able to be in person, and can they be online just because they're doing so much better online? Or can we integrate more of our remote learning practices into an in-person environment? Can we utilize more technology? If my social worker is consistently speaking on the lack of confidentiality, so we know that our students need social work services in person because there is not so much confidentiality, or we don't know what the confidentiality is when the students are at home. But my speech and language therapist is saying that a lot of her students are doing much better in this remote setting. So can that still be remote? Like, can I bring a student to my office for speech and language therapy on the computer, even if we're in the building? I think that this is, like I said, a very unique time, and I think that we've been pushing this buzzword equity as a school system for a very long time, and I haven't really seen it come to fruition. But I think that this is pushing us to not only learn how students learn individually, but how can we actually put that into practice instead of just saying that we know the student learns in a different way than 90% of the class.
Thank you. Well, it is nearly 7 o'clock. I want to be conscientious of our panelists' time. So on behalf of the Columbia Ed Law and Policy Society and the Columbia Law Students for Disability Rights, I'm so extremely grateful to all our panelists for both leading us and shining a light in tonight's discussion, and for the invaluable work you do on a daily basis. Sincerely, thank you, and have a good night.